and they began to organize. One of those is the Free Syria Society. It was secret because they were afraid of the Ottoman police, and that was justified fear, in fact.
But that was in America, free.
Yes.
Okay.
The Free Syria Society was headquartered in Flint, Michigan, and founded by a distant relative of mine on my mother's side, in fact.
Oh,
His name is
wow.
Amin Farah,
I
meaning
don't
we're not
appreciate
talking.
what you mean by that.
Yeah. So my work challenges, well, just about the entire breadth of Arab American studies at the time, which is now warming up to my work. But at the time, I mean, I had, and what
Wow.
came after it, after World War II, when Arab Americans became identified as such, they had an ascribed identity as Arab Americans per se. They became as full-fledged Americans from the war and started the Institute of Arab American Affairs. And they came closer to the center of power than we ever had in our history. Maybe with the exception of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee during the tenure of Albert Mukhayber, or before him, the late Senator James Aberez came close to that. But since then, no, the picture is very bleak. They don't understand, for example, that Arab Americans, like all immigrants, want what everyone else wants: some stability, access to education, jobs, a good life for their children. And they're loyal. They're loyal to this country. They have nowhere else to
Yeah.
go.
Welcome to Scholars Unravel the Middle East. I'm Adel Ali, your host. I was born in the Middle East but grew up in America, where I practiced patent law and later founded a startup based on my own inventions. And then I went on to my ultimate passion, history. But instead of repeating and reinterpreting sources of history, I bring you the sources themselves. I interview the scholars who research, analyze, and write history, scholars who distill their decades of research into an hour conversation with me. And my goal for this program is to correct our misperceptions and misconceptions about the Middle East, this fascinating region with its long and remarkable history. My guest is Dr. Hani Wabardi, a professor of history at the Center for Arab American Studies in the University of Michigan, Dearborn. His research and teaching areas include Middle East studies, Arab American studies, Arab American identity, Arab Americans since 1890, Michigan history, as well as history of immigrants and immigration. Dr. Bawardi has written extensively about these topics, including the following: the making of Arab Americans, from Syrian nationalism to U.S. citizenship. It's a book that we discuss in this interview, and we also discuss the following: when did Arab immigration to America begin? When did Arabs begin to form political organizations in America? Aside from their language, do Arabs have anything in common? Do Arab Americans have anything in common? What is Al-Nahda, and why is that an important word in modern Arab history? Did early Arab American organizations aim to impact change in America or in the Middle East? How did Arabs assimilate into American society? And how much political power do Arab Americans have in America now? I've also dropped links in the description to my two-part interview with Dr. Maha Nasser about the history of the people of Palestine, such as the exclusionary practices of the Crusaders and why Dr. Nasser asserts that historically there was no such a thing called Palestinians. Please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. And if you wish, check out the description for ways to support our program, which I appreciate. So, stay with me as Dr. Bawardi and I unravel the Middle East. Dr. Bawardi, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. I'm very much interested in speaking with you about your book, The Making of Arab Americans, from Syrian Nationalism to U.S. Citizenship. And my intention is to do that in sort of steps by asking you a series of questions that I hope my questions are not too onerous. And I'll start with this one that I think is very foundational. When did Arabs begin to immigrate to the United States?
It is difficult to say with certainty, but in discernible numbers, in the 1890s, a little bit earlier. I think an important date to keep in mind is 1876, the year the Centennial Philadelphia World Exposition took place.
Yeah.
And they actually attended uh, uh, expositions after that, 1893 in Chicago, etc. But that one actually was attended by a few, specifically, I have material evidence that a family from Jerusalem or a family member, Iskandar
Uh-huh.
Qort in Arabic, in Jerusalem came and displayed his wares. Those are builders in the city, local family. And he, like others, went back, spread the news, and people felt like this is a place with opportunities.
For them.
And
If I may interject, 1 point, 2 points, please. One is that when you say a family from Jerusalem, this must have been a very wealthy, established family that could actually afford to make the voyage to America for expositions, right?
well, not necessarily. I mean, you
Not
have to
necessarily.
have the means to pay for the travel,
Yeah,
but you also, it helps that if you're a business person with a budget to
yeah,
travel in order to make money. So it was like a commercial enterprise.
yeah.
Um,
And my second point is, was this voyage uh, commissioned or sponsored by the Ottoman Empire?
no,
No,
no, those were individuals traveling on their own recognizance. I mean, on their own,
on their
in
own. Yeah, yeah,
order to display their wares, sell a few things, and explore the place. We have to keep in mind that by that time, steamships were available and
yeah.
travel became much, much easier. By the third part of the 19th century,
Uh-huh.
mass travel became possible. So that is critical. Um, Otherwise, it would have been impossible, the
It
trip.
wouldn't have made sense to be there for weeks and weeks just to travel. So 1876, 1893, Arabs from the Palestine area, specifically Jerusalem, come attend exposition. Does
Well,
this?
I'm sorry, that was an example of a certain family, the court from Jerusalem, but others did make the trip, and in relatively small numbers, again for the same purpose, to show their wares and to participate, some by invitation, to exhibit different cultures in the Chicago World Fair, for example, and other world fairs. Um, like exoticism was part of the allure.
Yeah,
Uh, some came by invitation, I'm sure, but others came to visit and look around. We don't know how many of them came. In fact, until 1890 or so, many of the people who immigrated with the intention of staying were registered as Turks in Asia, and they came from different ports. Like it depended on the port of embarkation, how they were registered in the immigration records, even beyond that date. So we don't know how many Arabic-speaking people came. And another thing to keep in mind is that Jerusalem was a city in Palestine, historic Palestine, part of geographic Syria, or Bilad al-Sham, as the Arabs call it.
yeah, yeah,
And that comprises, includes east of the Jordan River, even all of historic Palestine, modern day Lebanon, and modern day Syria. All of that was like a part of the Fertile Crescent, a
yeah.
cohesive cultural, linguistic, historical unit.
So for sort of American immigration data, this is really obtuse. They either register them as Turks, or if anything else, this not. They're really looking at a large region, and it's not like these guys, these immigrants are specifically from Palestine or Lebanon, or it doesn't really
Exactly.
correlate with our modern understanding of statistics on immigration. So this sounds like, let me go back to this 1890 date. You mentioned they were registered as Turks from Asia. I got that part. Is there a certain time? Is that a time that you think Arabs started to come to America to settle, or that's still not certain either?
Yeah, it always depended on the push factors. There were, periods of stability. One of the events that pushed people out was a bug that killed the mulberry trees, which were used to cultivate silk. The silkworm
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fed on mulberry, and a bug killed a lot of those. That was an incentive to immigrate, but in discernible numbers. I mean, we have larger groups of people coming as families. 1890 was one of those peak years. 1913 is another. 1910 also a peak year. Closer to World War One, people felt that there will be trouble. It was no surprise, World War One, by the way. There's a
So
spark for it, the murder of Count Ferdinand. But the tension was building up towards that war because the Ottoman Empire
even in the Middle East.
across the Middle East, yeah, the
Yeah,
Eastern Mediterranean. So the Ottoman Empire was in a state of decline.
yeah,
And the European powers, especially Britain and France, were eyeing its territories because, especially Palestine and Lebanon, because they sit at the coast, Eastern Mediterranean, and that is the closest land bridge between the Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea or the Persian
yeah,
Gulf, if you will. So it was a very, very important strategic location. And they were exerting a lot of pressure on the Ottoman Empire to crack. But they were also cautious not to get into a fight over the territory themselves.
yeah,
So
yeah,
World War One provided the expedient solution for that.
yeah,
The Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks joined Germans in that war
yeah,
and put pitting themselves against the British and the French. So they became easy pick for them.
yeah.
And
Easy
when the
targets.
Germans and the Turks lost the war, their territory was fair game in the eyes of the Turks and in the eyes of the um,
British and the French.
British and the French. And the people of the area, like many like them around the world, in fact, hoped that the end of World War One and this on the heels of the century of nationalism, as we call it, that they would achieve a statehood. Um, what um, Woodrow Wilson called the 14 points, point 12, the right of self-determination,
Exactly. And
sovereignty, and things like that. They wanted what Europeans had, which is sovereignty.
yeah. Um, let's go back to Arab emigration. All these, crucible of military and political events are occurring in the Middle East. Nationalism, what have you, and that comes even more after the Versailles Treaty, in which President Wilson goes to Europe himself. What I'm wondering is this: at the outset of this conversation, I asked you, when did Arabs start coming to America? When, first of all, does that word in and of itself have a meaning, a collective meaning aside from language? And weaved into that question, I'm from Egypt, you're from northeast Iraq, and another person is from central Lebanon. We all arrived, we are all in New York City or Chicago or Michigan. Do we have anything in common?
Mm. Yeah, that's an important question. In the eyes of Western historians and Western, uh, you know, pundits and experts,
Uh-huh.
the answer is no. That awaited for them to build institutions around which, and the rise of journalism, etc., etc. I don't buy that at all. In fact, the people of the region had a very clear sense of who they were as Arabs because they had a shared history, collective memory, but they also had traditions, norms, mores, customs that tied them together. And that is one definition of a people, common traits, cultural traits. And there were enough of those, even food recipes. But they remembered their glorious past. In fact, by the mid 19th century, they were excavating their deep Arab and Islamic past and rewriting those stories. And the American missionaries and Franciscan missionaries contributed to that by introducing printing press. Um, it didn't, of course, those were tools, not instrumental or a deciding factor of like
Yeah.
generating this collective memory. It was there, woven into traditional, I mean, oral traditions.
When you
And
say, Dr. Babardi, when they were saying they were excavating their glorious past and revisiting their own history, sort of exposing it to the world, were they doing it in the European style? Just a few minutes ago, we talked about nationalism, right? So let's say someone from Italy would glorify Italy's, especially in the 19th century, right? Italy's glorious past, i.e., Roman, even though they had nothing in common with modern Italy, or France, or England, or were Arabs exposing, manifesting their glorious past as a collective? That's my question. Makes sense, Dr. Buardi?
yeah, it was a fluid situation for sure. For
Uh-huh.
example, in Italy around that time, Northern Italians had nothing in common with Southern Mezzo-Italiano.
Yeah.
Uh, and some Westerners argue that those were, locally integrated communities, patches of people with nothing in common. I don't think that it was that simple because the language is a very, very powerful
Of course,
common
yeah.
denominator. So is Islam and so is Christianity and Judaism, monotheism in general. So in those communities in Iraq, in Damascus, in Cairo, there were Jewish communities who spoke Arabic as their first language. Hebrew was never spoken everyday language until
Yeah.
well into the 1920s, I guess, because of the Zionist program kind of wanted to do that.
Yeah.
But they spoke Arabic. And there were Christian communities. Many cities had Christian majorities who identified as Arabs. In fact, when we get to the first part of the book about political identity or political action, that becomes much clearer. But they did identify as Arabs, Syrian, Orthodox, Melkite, Sunni, Shi'i, in that order. In that order. At
Interesting.
the forefront of their identity was the word Arab.
You
And
reinforce something that we sort of take it for granted, that language does matter. And I think even today, one of the big cohesive factors for the United States is language, English. And then that connects us to Britain for many different reasons, historically, and other English speaking. So I
yeah,
think that that's an important point for Arab history. You're saying that journalists and Western historians were saying, no, these Arabs are from, don't have anything in common.
that was a nice segue to their domination because they
Yeah.
like this is like one of the tools of colonialism is called imperialism, which is defining a people to make them ripe for creating those, commercial outposts. That's
Yeah.
what colonialism is. It's an advanced stage of capitalism, but in order to make it stick, you define those people.
And
You're
then the
about to
smaller
dominate.
they are, the easier they are to handle, to deal with.
However, we have to be mindful of the huge service the Americans did by bringing printing presses and a little money, although they wanted to proselytize, they wanted to turn people into
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Christians.
Yeah, yeah.
But they found that the population is already a monotheist and it's not easy to convert Muslims.
They tried
Muslims,
that in Iran as well.
yeah, I'm sure they did
Yeah.
around the
Okay.
same time, in fact, the British. But the Americans, so like Eli Smith and others, although Van Dyke finished the job, they translated the Bible into Arabic. But the one who did the translation is Butros al-Bustani. Butros al-Bustani and Ibrahim al-Yazigi and Muhammad Bayham and others, those were already before they did their work for the Americans translating things, already forming what is called the Syrian Scientific Society in order to cultivate a vision for a modern society they call their own that is had definable borders from the Taurus Mountains in the north, that's borders with Turkey, to the
Wow.
Sinai Desert in the south, and from the Mediterranean shores in the west to roughly the the Saudi or Arabian desert and the Iraqi desert in the east and southeast. They knew exactly who they were and what they wanted, although they also saw themselves as part of a larger Arab world. Wherever, I mean, Arabism precedes Islam. I mean, if you want to go back,
Yeah.
although it might, I mean, historians like to slide back in history till kingdom come. We're not going to do that. But Arabism was there, extension of the Nabatean culture. We have spoken and written Arabic well before Christian era, hundreds of years before that. So the narrative is existing, and there is a very sophisticated language that accommodated the Greek classics even before the translations took place. In modern time, in the 19th century, Arabs Arabs and non-Arabs, in fact, who were fluent in Arabic, and Nestorians in Persia, for example,
Yeah.
translated a lot of the Greek classics. And that's the only reason we know anything about Aristotle and the Iliads and all those Greek classics. Those translation houses in Baghdad and Damascus and across North Africa is the reason we know anything about them. So, but if we can leap to the 19th century, what they were translating at that time, or republishing, in fact, not translating, are the classics, Ibn al-Rumi, al-Mutanabbi, and al-Jahid, and
Mm.
the Arab contributions to sciences and literature, Ibn Khaldun, Al-Muqaddimah, or the introduction, the grounds for the science of sociology,
Yeah.
uh, and much more. So when the printing presses were brought to the area by the Americans in order to translate the Bible, they used the same printing presses to also republish all those classics which existed in
Interesting.
original form or in an oral tradition.
Yeah.
There
That's
were the result of that is something extremely important, can boil down to one word called Al-Nahda.
which
Nahda
means
it means like getting up from a slumber or from a lying down position. Renaissance is the implication. Nahda is a huge word in Arabic, literary and cultural and political and social life, because that was the time when they began to articulate what their lives should look like as people of a cohesive, definable state. Just like you,
and this Renaissance, Al-Nahda, this is taking us to the late 19th century, early 20th century, right?
it was mid 19th century, it became
Okay.
pronounced. You can hear the word. By the late 19th century, it became focused because people knew that the end of the Ottoman Empire is near and that they have to think ahead. And they articulated that, and you had secret societies like Al-Ahd and Al-Arabi al-Fatat, and also public societies who sought autonomy from the Ottoman Empire, but wanted to keep the Ottoman Empire as an umbrella because they knew if the Ottoman Empire collapses completely, they will fall under British and French occupation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that's exactly what happened.
So they wanted
The Western-
autonomy, not complete political independence as a separate polity. I see.
some of them did. That was actually like a first step towards complete independence. That's
Yes.
what Western scholars are reluctant to understand or acknowledge. And I have material evidence in my papers that Al-Arabi al-Fatat was reborn in the United States as the Free Syria Society. And I have their bylaws. I published part of them in that book you referred to. You
Yeah.
were kind enough to refer to The Making of Arab Americans
Yes.
from
Yes.
Syrian Nationalism to U.S. Citizenship. The bylaws are a mirror image of the bylaws of a secret society that was very powerful and widespread called Al-Arab al-Fatat. It was so secret that to this day we don't know all their members. They
That
just
is
happen to
fascinating.
have
And by the
these
way,
bylaws.
if speaking of these bylaws, and you refer to the title of your book, in the title of your book, when you say Syria, you mean Blad al-Sham. You don't mean the modern Syria. It's the larger, greater Syria that was referred to in history up to recent 20th century, mid
That
20th.
is correct. In
Okay,
fact,
got it.
Palestinians often call themselves Southern Syrians. There was a newspaper called Southern Syria, in fact.
Oh,
They were
wow.
Palestinians, but they were also Arabs and part of Syria. So they were Lebanese and the Lebanon, the Mount Lebanon area around Beirut, and the rest of Syria or Bilad al-Sham.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about Arab Americans and American politics. Um, Dr. Bawardi, when did Arab Americans begin to form political organizations to represent them here in America?
Well, I documented one as early as 1915, but that
Oh,
was, I doubt that was the first one because there is a clergy named Basil Kharbawi who sent out a survey and put the results of his inquiries into a book he published in 1913. And there is reference to collectives by then already. So they hit the ground running. When they came here, many immigrants, I was among them, still might still be still, in fact, who have this really tenacious or stubborn um, thought that one day they'll go back. But the early
wow.
immigrants really were convinced that they will go back one day, and they want to go back to reform the Syria, the coveted Syria of theirs, just like Palestinians would like to go back to a Palestine one of these days. And
Exactly.
many immigrants, with the ease of travel, they keep those links alive uh, very often. But yeah, they felt like they wanted to go back, so they wanted to kind of absorb these precepts of democracy and go and apply it overseas. And they began to organize. One of those is the Free Syria Society. It was secret because they were afraid of the Ottoman police, and that was justified fear, in fact.
But that was in America, free.
Yes.
Okay.
The Free Syria Society was headquartered in Flint, Michigan, and founded by a distant relative of mine on my mother's side, in fact.
Oh,
His name
wow.
is Amin Farah. It's the only reason the reason why I became a historian is that his son, Rushd or Roy, is no longer with us now, gave me all his papers, and those papers included the most complete records of the Free Syria Society, the New Syria Party, the Arab National League, and the Institute of Arab American Affairs. These are the backbone of the
What
book.
what a treasure trove, Dr. Bawardi. Um,
Indeed.
I want to parse this a little bit. 1913, 1915, you get uh, you have evidence of organization, political organization of Arab Americans.
Yeah, important to note that those were formal organizations, not primary group affiliations.
I
Meaning,
don't
we're not
appreciate
talking.
what you mean by that.
Yeah. So my work challenges, well, just about the entire breadth of Arab American studies at the time, which is now warming up to my work. But at the time, I mean, I had endless conversations with Michael Suleiman, one of the fathers of Arab American studies.
Mhm.
And he wanted to see evidence. He's a political scientist. He wanted to see evidence of like voting trends or things like that.
Yeah.
And he acknowledged that there, uh, maybe after World War One, you had formal organizations, but otherwise, most people thought those were village associations or familial networks or church or mosque groups.
Mhm.
This is what we mean by primary group affiliations,
But you're
not formal political.
but the ones that you mentioned, 1913, 1915, those were formal.
Yes,
I see.
political.
Oh, that's
That was the
fascinating.
first departure from the established scholarship at the time. And frankly, some to this day, because we don't have too many Arabic speakers who are experts in the Middle East doing Arab American studies, the book has been referred to numerous times, dozens of times, sheepishly in a limited way. But it's really, this is a really important point to understand, like, because there is a massive amount of evidence in Arabic about Arab national thought and Al-Nahda and even literary traditions that began to change and reflect that aspiration. You don't have that much of it in English. that is accessible to most scholars. And I'm one of few, although the numbers are increasing, but for a time I was one of two people in the US doing Arab American studies who was a native speaker in Arabic.
Yeah, actually,
That's
I
where we
spoke
are.
to another scholar, Dr. Nassar of Arizona University, University of Arizona. I apologize, and she said the same thing. She said there are very few scholars who actually can read primary source in Arabic. So your point is something that needs to be addressed. I want to go back again to this 1913, 1915, and formal organizations. You, you gave me the dates, then you followed it with this phrase. You said, these early immigrants wished or hoped that they would one day go back to their homelands, maybe in the greater Syria, and bring back the precepts of democracy. Many of them didn't. But therein lies an important question. So when they were forming political organizations, were those political organizations to create this collective power to effect change back home in the Middle East? Or was it for their immediate issues in Chicago? We need a preschool. Let's go to our congressman. Back then, they were mostly men, congressman, to have a preschool in Flint. Do you see what those are two different types of political organizations?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I do appreciate the question very much because they had to navigate both. They
Both.
had needs and objectives and aspirations here in this country, although they kept an eye on what's happening overseas, and that was the focus of much of their efforts. And in following years, like with the New Syria Society or New Syria Party, it was all about ridding Syria of French occupation and creating it into the coveted state. Back home was the glue that held them together and gave them direction. Those were core ideas around which they can all coalesce and bond.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, even Arabic-speaking folks who came from Iraq, Egypt, North America, Sudan, the Gulf, wherever you call it, come together for the same core issues. Yeah, that's why Palestine is very prominent in Arab American life because it represents so much that is missing, for example. But that's a really important point. But my one of the points I make in the book is that around these efforts, they were able to forge social service organizations here in the States to serve their constituencies. For example, the Syrian United Syrian Society
Mm-hmm.
was a social service organization. At the same time, its president,
For
or
here in America.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
but they are the ones who commissioned or empowered a newspaper editor named Najib Diab, editor of Mir'at al-Gharb, or Mirror of the West, to go in 1913 to the first Arab conference in Paris and deliver the immigrants' message of unity and statehood for Syria, eventual complete independence. And if I have to estimate, he may have been a member of the Al-Arab al-Fatat, or the Young Arab Society, which is a secret society. Um, Around
Wow.
that time, 1913, 1914, 1915, it became clear, especially after World War I started in Europe in 1914, the Arab Americans here in this country, the ones who knew all about the first Arab conference in Paris, where the Syrians and others said, okay, we want statehood, but we want to stay under the Ottoman umbrella, fearing European colonization. That's an important point that's ignored by most. Um, so they had, it was that society, a social service organization that fought for citizenship among its members, that commissioned or empowered a delegate to go and argue for political aims in the Middle East.
To
So they
follow.
navigated the two.
The
the
two,
two objectives.
both their political interests to affect change back home in the Middle East, if you will. And I say back home for the immigrant generation
Yes.
in particular. And second, also bring about some of the things that they needed, such as my example, like a preschool, social changes and things that they needed right here in America. Um, you've said this several times, and I want to make sure I follow why you're saying this. You said some of these societies were secret, including the one
Mhm.
right here, Free Syrian Society in the United States.
Mhm.
What was the reason for it to be secret here in the U.S.? The Ottoman Empire was far away; it was no longer a potent empire. Could
Mhm.
the Ottomans somehow reach and affect them somehow in America?
Yeah,
Oh
they
wow,
could. They had the
wow,
Ottomans had agents and spies, and many of those immigrants traveled sometimes when they can.
yeah.
For example, the editor of Jurab al-Kurdi is another newspaper in New
Mm.
York. His name is Anton Zreik. He traveled to see family in 1915 and was caught and killed, tortured and killed by the Turks.
Oh
And he wasn't the
wow.
only one. Many travelers from South America and uh, among them also the leaders of the this Nahda movement or the nationalist Syrian movement were also hanged in public by the Turks. So it was a real threat. So
Oh
when they
wow.
exchanged letters, I have like a series of letters. I have not published those. I do refer to them in the book between Amin Farah, the fellow I mentioned earlier, the founder
Mm.
of the Free Syria Society.
Who's
Uh,
related to you?
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and a colleague called Gibran Kuzma, who's a well-known nationalist in Palestine, and Nicola Kobane, who was working for the British in Egypt and then the Sudan, I think. He brought all the letters exchanged between the three friends, and the seed for the Free Syria Society was in those letters. And he very, very carefully, meticulously scraped off any references to names and sometimes addresses. And he
Oh
smuggled them in the United States. Usually, they smuggled information they felt sensitive inside magazines and books and
yeah.
newspapers. But also, the Arabic language press was very vibrant. مرآة الغرب, كوكب أمريكا first, Al-Huda, which had like a Maronite pro-French tinge because of its
Marinette
editor.
from Lebanon. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're talking about Arab publications here in the United States.
Yes, those
Yeah.
I wanted to mention that on the pages of those papers, which were exempt from Ottoman scrutiny because they're American publications, although they were in Arabic, the authors published the writings of Rashid Rida and all those nationalists and Rafiq al-Adham in Egypt, in the safety of Egypt, away from the French,
Yeah,
ironically,
because it was under,
although Egypt was under British control,
yeah.
preaching what democracy means to the leadership here in the United States. So it was very ironic that, those
Interesting.
reformers,
Wow. You're
yeah,
getting publications from Egypt to reach Arabs that
the,
lived in
the, the
America.
authors, the authors from Egypt will
Yeah.
publish in the Arab American press,
Oh, I
preaching
see.
local audiences what democracy is all about in order to vote, but also to increase awareness of what democracy looks like for their constituencies across Syria.
Wow,
Because in
that's
Syria they
amazing.
could receive those كوكب أمريكا مرآة الغرب, less so Al-Huda, because it was not a nationalist magazine, although it had a variety of views in it sometimes.
Hmm.
But the editor was really pro-French. He wreaked havoc. He was a very harsh personality because he was paid by the French. I was
Yeah.
able to establish that, in fact.
Let's
Other
take a break
magazines like
here.
Al-Bayan,
I'm sorry,
there
go ahead,
were
please.
other newspapers across
Yeah.
on the East Coast and also in the Detroit area.
Dr. Babardi, let's take a break here and then talk about assimilation of Arab Americans and also Arab Americans that came after the tail end of the Cold War afterwards. We'll be right back. Dr. Babardi, I'm going to ask you a question that you and I can talk about for hours, but uh, I'm just curious. we're talking about the early 20th century, late 19th century. You have Arab Americans that come here. Many of them are Muslim Arabs. In that era, and this is for the benefit of our audience and a reminder for you and I, perhaps, you know, Catholics and Jews and Orthodox Christians were considered total foreigners to the American Protestant system. And there was major backlash against those European immigrants. I hate to think what it was like for Arab Americans to come from almost an entirely different civilization, right? That's a bit of an exaggeration, but do you see my point? They're Muslims, they come
Yeah.
here. What was that like? How did they assimilate, if at all?
Yeah. The majority of the early comers were Christian, and they
Christian.
looked white enough. And at that,
Wide enough. I love that.
but
Okay.
the ones who had a dark tan
Uh-huh.
were not safe in the South. In fact, there is at least one murder, lynching of an Arab American in the South.
Oh, wow.
So they were in the same boat as Southern Eastern Europeans. Couched in your question somewhere is this dichotomy between Catholics and Protestants, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, immigration restrictions and eugenics and the pushback against immigration. Yes,
1920s was infamous era for that,
yeah.
right?
So what happened is that between 1890 or so and the start of World War One in 1914, about 13.8 million or so immigrants came from Southern Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
and those were mostly Catholics. The Arabic-speaking folks, some Muslims, although we kind of underestimate their numbers very often, and we need to do some work on that and establish exactly what their numbers were. We haven't done that, frankly, in the scholarship. But you can safely say that the majority were Christians. They came in the same time, at the same time, and they were not well received with open arms because
Yeah.
they were needed to fuel the factories and work and all of that. I mean, this country was built by immigrants, as you know. Um, but the Protestant Northwestern Europeans were alarmed at this diluting their, the bloodline purity.
Yeah.
That's they spoke in those terms. In fact, they came up with a pseudoscience called eugenics because the Poles and Italians, some of them from northern Italy or Eastern Europeans, looked white enough. But they came up with this crazy idea that there's the Alpines who are pure white from northwestern Europe, and then the rest they look white, but they are inferior, hence eugenics,
Wow.
using race as like classification to d- distinguish between acceptable whites and non-acceptable white-like people. In fact, the Irish who came even earlier in the mid-19th century suffered the same fate,
Yeah.
also because they're Catholics, and they suffered a lot of violence, probably more so than any other immigrant group.
Yeah.
Uh, Gangs in New York captures part of that film by Scorsese.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
it was a very violent period. So this is the background for mentioning something very important that might help the listeners understand how this country reacted. There were immigration restrictions at the time. So ironically, it was northeastern business people who said, yeah, we have to limit the immigration by those guys who were liberal, as a matter of fact, but they were worried about racial purity. Um, Business owners wanted immigrants because they paid them next to nothing to fuel their factories. Other politicians said, no, enough of those, inferior races. We don't want them
And
anymore.
when you say inferior races, I know we were talking predominantly about Catholic Europeans, but
Southern
Arab
Eastern,
Americans were also lumped into that, right?
yes, they were.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
In fact, they were. And so by 1924, between 1917 and 1924, they came up with what's called the quota system, immigration restrictions, the Hart-Celler Act, which said that first 3% and finally 1% of the people from any region that are already here can enter. So immigration from the Levant was all but stifled. It was like a trickle. And also from Southern Eastern Europe. It was reduced drastically, few hundred as opposed to tens of thousands
Wow.
entered a year. So that, hence, there is like in Arab American life, there is no contiguity in terms of, batches of immigration. That was a major first, if you want to call it wave, it's not far-fetched, I guess. Although the numbers are minuscule compared to the millions who came from Southern Eastern Europe. 4 million Jewish people came from Poland and Russia. Uh, the entire Syrian immigration population at the time, which we do not have reliable numbers for, could not have been more than 200,000, 300,000 at the outset.
Oh,
You have
wow.
2 million Poles, 2 million Italians,
Yeah,
and 4 million Eastern European Jews came during that period. So our numbers were very small,
yeah.
uh, within a minority in the overall scheme of things in the United States.
I want to fast forward several decades and bring it to a time where I can speak from my own personal experience. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and traveled quite a bit, uh, very frequently to New York City, Manhattan, primarily. And since the mid 90s to the teens of this century, 2012, 2015, 2016, I saw an explosion of Arab population in San Francisco. And that's a good point because it's an urban area. You see a lot of people. You're not just driving your car this detached from everyone else. But both in San Francisco and New York, and in fact, right now in New York, you see um, Arab Americans everywhere. Is this considered a wave? Is this a wave that happened in the 1990s,
Yeah.
1980s?
Yeah, there was like a large number came. I mean, the Gulf Wars facilitated the entry of around 140,000 Iraqis. That immigration restriction, the quota system I mentioned earlier, was removed in 1965. That allowed me, among others, to come here on a student visa, by the way.
Oh, wonderful.
And of course, the Iranian Revolution sent a lot of people packing and came to the United States, 1978, 79. So when the quotas were removed, many people came not only from the Levant, but also from Egypt, from North Africa, and other places, Arabic speakers, but not to, of course, alongside a lot of Iranians and Turks and many nationalities came in large numbers. In fact, the 1980s immigration exceeded the late 19th century. Also, Cubans came in
Yeah,
large numbers during the Reagan years, for example. So, yeah, but what you call explosion, I mean, we have to keep it in perspective because these are still a minority, but they seemed, there is something called in immigration, it might be my own terminology, the chain link migration or patron-client
uh-huh.
relationship.
What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, the reason why I came to Flint, it turned out, was Amin Farah, although I never met him.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
died
yeah.
in 1975, years before I came to the States. I never heard of the man, but he settled in Flint. And when he did well, he brought, another family member who brought his future wife, would-be wife, and he married her in Portland, Maine, and came to Flint. And his brother-in-law became so successful, he became known as Uncle Sam. His name is Subhi,
Oh, I
and
love it.
became like a owner of a small grocery dynasty, grocery store, like convenience stores.
Yeah, yeah,
A lot of immigrants came where this guy was doing well and were lured into the business themselves. So and that continues to this day, in fact.
yeah,
Now the dominant Palestinian group, at least in Flint, are from Beit Sahur because they were pushed out by the Israeli occupation, many of them during the first Intifada, for
yeah.
example. But that chain link migration is responsible for concentration of Arabs. For example, in Dearborn, Michigan, after the Lebanese Civil War, 1974, uh, thousands came. Because they don't spread out to the periphery in those concentric zones, as we call them. When immigrants do well, they go to the suburb.
Yeah.
And the suburbs get crowded and they're wealthy. And we did fairly well economically. Iranians and Arabs and others did
Yeah.
very well economically. They would move even further than the center of the city, the industrial
Hmm.
where minorities live. But in San Francisco area, the Palestinians became dominant in the grocery
Yeah.
retail.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know if they still are or not. They probably diversified by now. In Dearborn, Michigan, instead of moving to the suburb, when they do well, they buy two houses, knock them down, and build a mansion and stay in town. I need to do a study on that actually. Um,
Sounds
and that's why
sounds very
you have
Persian.
the largest concentration of Arabs outside the Middle East is in Dearborn, Michigan for that reason. But numerically, I think California may have more Arabs and New York. Chicago is very close to Michigan. But in terms of concentration,
Do we have a number for the Arab American population in America now?
um, there is a number that's tossed around of 3.5 million, but that includes heritage Arabs, all the people who immigrants and the ones descendants of immigrants, third, fourth, and now even fifth generation of those Lebanese and Syrian who came late 19th century, for example.
Yeah.
All of them
So
put together. The numbers are not huge.
they're not huge. This 3.5 million, whatever it is, it's no longer minuscule 200,000. It's much, much higher than that, obviously. Some in the million, some millions. Have they been able to form cohesive political organizations that affect some sort of change?
Well, they did much better at in the first 50 years of the 20th century than we're doing now. In
Oh,
fact,
wow.
one of the organizations in my book, the Arab National League, which started as the Palestine National League as a reaction to the Balfour Declaration.
Uh-huh.
And that Balfour Declaration is a one-page letter from a British official to Baron Rothschild telling him that we look with favor upon the establishment of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, hence laying the foundation for the Arab-Israeli conflict. The reaction to that was the Palestine National League, which went into remission while the Syrian revolt demanded attention. Hence, the new Syria Party, headquartered in Highland Park, Michigan, very cohesive, highly
Mhm.
organized, more so than the Free Syria Society. But the Arab National League, my point, was the largest per capita and the most organized of any grassroots Arab American organization to this day. And what
Wow.
came after it, after World War II, when Arab Americans became identified as such, they had an ascribed identity as Arab Americans per se. They became as full-fledged Americans from the war and started the Institute of Arab American Affairs. And they came closer to the center of power than we ever had in our history. Maybe with the exception of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee during the tenure of Albert Mukhayber, or before him, the late Senator James Aberez
Mhm.
came close to that. But since then, no, the picture is very bleak. Social service organizations do very well, usually by distancing themselves from the core idea that created them. Often, in our case, in our neck of the woods here, we have a very successful organization that does a lot of wonderful work in terms of social services, but it did not navigate the aspirations of its own constituency when it comes to uh, national affiliations or their hopes for Palestine and other areas of the region. They shied away from that in order to get grants and grow and avoid controversy,
Interesting.
as
So,
they call it. So, no, we did not do very well in terms of formal political lobbying.
So from that, I appreciate this question can be a whole podcast on its own, but from what you just stated is that I sort of gather that in the Arab Spring, that was, I think it was in 2011, or the current war in Gaza, um, these Arab American organizations are not that active as they are in local social issues.
Well, we have to be clear on which these Arab organizations, if you're talking about Arab American Center for Social and Economic Services, Access, the largest one we have of $40 million dollar budget, no, they're not political. They are very cautious and walking a thin line in their own minds, I think, in my view. Then what's left? What other organizations are there? We don't have a powerful lobbying arm.
Yeah.
Washington, D.C., for example. We tried that. However, right now, I
Did that
can,
fail? You say we tried that.
they systematically they fail. And when the ADC, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, was basically the center of the most advanced, cutting edge scholarship on the issues that really mattered to most Arab Americans, which is Palestine out of necessity, because that's where the need is the greatest.
Yeah.
It was very successful. It was also its downfall. And I'm writing this about this in a new book. It'll take me more than a few minutes to explain, so I'll leave that to the
Yeah.
side.
Yeah.
But I just came back yesterday from the People's Conference on Palestine, which took place in downtown Detroit. And there were almost 3,000 youth there, very enthusiastic youth that came out for Palestine. Marches in Dearborn alone dwarf the number of the people who came out for against the war in Vietnam, by the way, even per capita.
Mhm.
We have 10,000 people at a time go out and march.
Yeah.
The numbers are much larger in New York and Chicago. It's incredibly active, and the Bay Area are very, very effective. We have our problems, and mentoring and how young people sound is different than in my days. I mean, they're very enthusiastic. Do they have a strategy or not? It's a different question.
Yeah.
But what happened in Gaza since October of last year changed everything. And now I think because of the involvement of other minorities and Jewish Americans who do not like what's happening in Gaza, the Israeli behavior or Israeli policies, we have a nucleus for a major movement that could yield an outcome.
An
Uh,
outcome. Are you Palestinian American, Dr. Bawardi?
My folks are from Nazareth, but they were expelled in 1948. So I'm a Palestinian who was born in Jordan. I usually keep that information from my students, but there you go. You blew my cover.
By
But
the way, in our
of course, our classrooms are safe for everyone. We're concerned with issues of fact and responsible interpretation of history, but there's room for a Zionist point of view, an atheist point of view, a heathen point of view. I mean, you know how it is with our class.
as the way as it should be. That's wonderful. Let's
Absolutely.
take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Bawardi as we get into the perspective. Dr. Bawardi, for the last hour, we've been talking about your research and some of the history you've debunked, and you told me how you got into history because of all the papers you received. What I want to know is this: why did you write this specific book? I know you're a scholar, you know, publish or perish. Everyone knows that you have, but why this specific book?
I'm not that pragmatic, frankly. I did get my tenure after the book. That was important. You need tenure if you're teaching, otherwise you will perish.
Yeah, yeah.
There's truth to that. But frankly, my
You
motivation
got
was
your tenure after the book or before the book?
after the book. The
After the
book
book.
actually was the key to
There you
that.
go.
That's how you perish
There you
otherwise.
go. Yeah.
Um, uh, but yeah, I think understanding my own experience. I mean, my master's thesis, the reason, the path that led me to Roy or Rushd Farah, the son of Amin Farah, was inquiring about why do so many Arabs own grocery stores in Flint, Michigan. They
Yeah.
owned 102 out of 104 grocery stores in the mid
Wow.
1990s.
That's like a monopoly. Okay.
And I
Wow.
used to volunteer to lecture about effects of Arab culture on Spanish civilization and things like that to local elementary school children with a good friend of mine, a teacher, and a young um, student asked me, why do Arabs own grocery stores? Because he's like in the inner city in Flint, Michigan. Every store is owned by an Arab, in fact.
Yeah.
And the chain supermarkets were actually located outside the city perimeter for tax purposes. So the question was poignant. I was hanging out with friends on Mount Olive in Jerusalem once, and one of the guys said, ask me the same question. And I said, there must be something there. And by the way, I own the business myself because of the chain link migration.
Yeah. Do you
And
own a grocery store? Is that it? No, no.
um, not anymore.
Not anymore.
I wanted to know, I did a survey, in fact, and I found out that the result was so uniform, I had to stop it at 33 participants. I was going for 75, which is the majority of the merchants in the city. And I asked him, did you know you will own a business like this one before you came to the States? And the answer was overwhelmingly 98% was no. And that also reflected my own experience. I did dabble in business and did very well, by the way. So switching to academia is like a conscious decision to become poor, but one I'm happy with, of course. But
Yeah.
yeah, I did dabble in business um, successfully, like many others like me. But the one who laid the seed for all of that was Amin Farah.
Yeah, the one. Yeah.
He owned the business, and as his brother-in-law owned many and sponsored others into the business, and that became a very important stepping stone. However, that did not kind of circumscribe his experience and did not circumscribe mine because I
Yeah.
was an activist in Flint. I was far busier outside the business than I was inside the business. Like we put like tennis tables in high schools and built, baseball diamonds here and there. Did what we can, few of us that is, around Thanksgiving and things like that. We were involved. I was one of those people who was very much involved in
In the
the
community.
in the
So,
community.
did you write this book with an attempt to tell the Arab American story? I ask that from the perspective that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like the Arab American experience in America is sort of neglected. Even
Mhm.
when you turn on PBS, which really delves into these things, you don't see too many documentaries on that.
Yeah, it's changing little by little.
Yeah.
I'm part of a group of people called the Washington State Historical Society in New York.
Hmm.
Got a Mellon Foundation grant now in order to install an art that celebrates Al-Rabat al-Qalamiyya or the pen bond. Khalil Gibran and his friends of authors, Gibran, father of
Oh,
the Prophet,
yeah.
and Ali Abu Madi and Nasib Arida and many others who are extremely important in the annals of Arab literature worldwide, in fact. So that changing a little bit, but overall, maybe because of our numbers, but now because of the elections and what's happening in Gaza, we're getting a lot of attention. But overall, even within Arab American studies, um, hardly any of the early writings, which is copious writings by the immigrants, have been translated or even looked at. They described in details the day-to-day life in Lower West Side of Manhattan, for example. We know very little about that. We're trying to, yeah, we need more people who are fluent in Arabic, but with the immigration restrictions, I'm not very optimistic that will happen unless we branch out to satellite universities in the Gulf and elsewhere and begin a concerted effort to translate. But
This is
yes,
this is kind of like the cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, the issue with them is not that there's not enough. The issue is that there's not enough people to read them. The same here. You have a treasure trove of Arabic language documents from Arab Americans right here
That's
in
a great
America.
analogy, in fact.
Yeah, you just
Absolutely.
don't have people to read them and translate. That's fascinating. And let's go back to something you said at the end of the last segment. You said, I was asking you about current development or evolution, especially what's happening in Gaza or what happened with the Arab Spring during Mr. Obama's administration. You said slowly changes coming and outcomes. It may have some sort of outcome. I forget the exact words you used. Is that in relation to the 2024 presidential election? Is there a target that Arab Americans are going after?
Um, they agree on a few things, Arab Americans, but Palestine is one of them.
Palestine is
It
one of them.
apparently is one of them. Of course, we're not a monolith. We have Republicans, we have Democrats,
Of course.
libertarians, and we have agnostics in political terms who will vote for a third party. But I think the non-committal vote in the term elections sent a clear message. We were hoping for 20, 30,000 non-committed votes for the president, uh, choice of president. We got over 100,000. That is enough to sway the election in Mr. Trump's favor.
Oh boy.
What are we getting out of Trump? I doubt we'll get anything out of Trump unless we ask. I don't know if we should ask, if we're asking or not. It's probably prudent not to put all your eggs in one basket because, frankly, neither party serves Arab American causes, core causes, something, things that are dear and near to them. U.S. policy towards the Middle East is archaic and hostile, and as it is to in terms of Iran, regardless of the merits of those, policies,
Yeah.
they're hostile towards the Palestinians, almost terminally so, while the Palestinians always look to the United States for solutions, and they're drawn to American culture. Many of them are educated, if not most of them, in the West, in the United States very often, and yet um, it's like a very incoherent policy of unwavering support for one side because of local lobbying.
Local
And
lobbying. So
in
do you
fact,
think Arab American communities will become a stronger lobbying force going forward? Is that something that's being talked
yeah,
about?
absolutely. And we're not good at it, frankly.
Yeah.
I'll admit that. What gives us like a little bit of reach is the alliances that we are gaining, especially recently. We will never have the numbers to sway elections. We can affect change in local elections.
Yeah.
We're tied to the Democratic Party too much. And the national level, or in terms of national policy, that does not serve us at all. Yes, we win as part of the party machine locally, but on the national sphere, we don't cut a major figure, to borrow the dated language by Philip Hetty in 1920. Um, but the alliances we could build, and we should be working on that, will make a difference. I think there is enough Jewish Americans now, Jewish Voices for Peace, but also a lot of Jewish Americans across the country, across the world, but here locally, and subaltern people, people who are fed up with the status quo, are coming together and beginning to change their minds about the Arab-Israeli conflicts in terms of unwavering, terminal, unchanging sympathy for Israel. Now they're beginning to question that, and more than half of the young people in this country, between 20 and 30 something,
Mhm.
change their minds already.
Yeah.
That will have an effect on the elections moving forward. And now the world community condemned Israel in no uncertain terms. And now the ICC issued arrest warrants or issued wanted is seeking
has
charge.
requested
Yeah.
seeking charges. So, from what I gather, then the Arab American community, and that phrase in itself is really sort of a generalization, may actually vote against Mr. Biden or not vote at all in the 2024 election, which is essentially against Mr. Biden. That's the common sense. Wow, that's that'll have grave consequences, big consequences going forward. Um, uh, Dr. Bawardi, if you wanted our audience to just remember one point about Arab Americans, what would it be?
It's a community that's been coming of age for a time now, that deserve a place in American public life.
Yeah,
Their representations and um, impact is disproportionate to their numbers, economically and socially and politically, frankly, of late. And people should not draw conclusions based on dated information about who Arabs are, what they are, from the mainstream media or
yeah,
even the mainstream networks
yeah,
for news about the conflict in the Middle East, but also about who an Arab and what an Arab is. We have a glut of Hollywood and, in print, in commercials, in textbooks, even in comic books that depicts Arabs and Muslims, including Turks and Iranians and
hmm
others, all Muslims and Arabs, as something mysterious or negative, frankly, in a
yeah,
negative sense. I hope that is running its course now that more than half of the population in this country are descendants of people other than Northwestern European. And I
yeah,
think that's what's scaring the Trump types, that they're losing something. They don't understand, for example, that Arab Americans, like all immigrants, want what everyone else wants: some stability, access to education, jobs, a good life for their children. And they're loyal. They're loyal to this country. They have nowhere else to
yeah.
go. They
That's an
belong.
important point. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Dr. Babardi, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much, Dr. Babardi.
Pleasure. Thank you.